Hey, morning, guys. It is March 14th. Um, Before I jump into, and we're talking about obedience and yielding in particular, that word, Chambers, deals with quite a bit in today's study. Yielding. When I was young, when I was in my late teens, actually, when I was 14, I started to smoke cigarettes. And by the time I was 16, I was pretty much hooked and smoked regularly. By the time I was 21, 22 years old. I had been addicted to cigarettes, and I smoked pretty regularly. Um, at 22 years old, I in driving around one morning, I was praying and thought, and was really wanted to give it up because I thought it was an addiction that held some power over me that I needed to yield to God. And so one of the things that I did, and it was effective, was to take a brand new pack of cigarettes that I just bought. I know for some of you, you're like, "Oh my goodness, you used to smoke." It's kind of hard to believe, but it's true. Um, and I took a pack of cigarettes, and it seems weird to think about offering some um, element of addiction or some instrument of addiction, offering it as a sacrifice, but that's exactly what I did. I kind of offered that as a sacrifice to God and said, "Here, I give this to you. This is a sacrifice." And it's the last cigarettes I ever picked up. I threw them away, a whole pack. And so what I learned in that is what Chambers is kind of getting to here. Yielding is something that we do, and he kind of puts a different spin on it. We either we're slaves to sin, which leads to death, is what Romans 6 talks about, or we're slaves to obedience, which leads to righteousness. And wrapped up in righteousness is life. And so he says in this first part, in Romans 6:16 is where he focuses here, his servants ye are to whom ye obey. And the way the NIV puts it is, you're slaves to the one whom you obey, whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. And and I wanted to just kind of highlight a few things that he talks about here in yielding. If you think about a roundabout, and people in Central Virginia unfortunately have no idea how to use roundabouts, and so if you remember when you learned about roundabouts in driver's ed, you always yield to the person on the left, or that is in the roundabout, that's currently in the roundabout. And so that means, what does it mean to yield? That means that you submit to them and let that thing or that person have authority, if you will, or preeminence, or whatever you want to say. And that's what he's talking about here, yielding. I am responsible, he says in this first part, for being thus dominated. Talking about this power that dominates us, because I have yielded. I've yielded. It's really funny. He says, I've yielded myself to myself. I think maybe a better way to put that would be, I've yielded my will to my nature. I think that captures it. My nature is sin. Our nature is sin, and we have to realize that we have to make this conscious decision not to yield our will to our nature, the nature of sin that we have, every single one of us. He talks later, further down, once you have yielded, and though you may hate yourself for having yielded, you're a bond slave to that thing. So giving over my will to my nature makes me a slave to the thing, to that piece of my nature, whether it's an addictive nature or whatever, that I yielded to, that I gave over. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but one of the things that Romans 6:16, or Romans 6, the whole chapter, if you read through Romans 6, it's a really good chapter. It's talking about, should we keep on sinning just because grace abounds? And of course not. And then what do we do? And it really talks about taking the parts, and this is why I brought up the smoking thing, taking the parts of us that we used to yield to sin, and taking those and kind of redeeming those things in us, those desires in us, those even those addictive tendencies we have, taking those and turning it on its head, and now yielding that to righteousness in obedience to Jesus. And so that's a tricky one, and that's a personal one too. And I would say to you, one of the things that we need to do a better job of is being real with God and saying, okay, what would you have me yield to you? What is in my life that I am currently, that's currently that has captured my will, and I know I need to yield my will to you. What is it? What part of me? What what piece of me needs to be yielded? And he talks later on, and I'll wrap it up with this, but he talks about being slaves to ourselves. Slavery to yourself is an expression he uses at the end of the study here. And it's a really interesting one. Again, I would say, I think more effectively would be this concept of yielding my will to my nature. So I would say to you today, maybe think about those parts of your nature, of your sinful nature that you're currently yielding to, whether it be stubbornness or anger or lust or pride, and say, okay, how can I start to then take those parts of me and turn them over to and yield and be turn them over to God for Him to use. I'll leave it at that for now. I think, in all honesty, I'm pretty sure that all of you have thought of things that that kind of fit into those categories. And so anyway, today my prayer for you is that God would help us, help you and me both, to yield our will to Him versus to our nature. Have a great day, guys.